Welcome, sir. Would you like to see our newest collection? Keep an eye on him.
Is every customer treated this way? May I see that overcoat?
That piece is reserved for private clients. I see.
How much would everything in this store cost?
Good afternoon, sir. Welcome to Langston Maison.
I'm here for my appointment.
Wait, you know him.
Mister, my apologies for the delay.
Everything is prepared exactly as requested.
What are those documents? What's going on here?
Please review the final pages before we proceed.
The transfer is complete. Wait, what just happened?
This can't be possible. Now that everything is settled.
Watch him closely. Meredith Langston said it quietly, the words barely reaching the security guard stationed near the entrance. But her eyes were already fixed on the man who had just stepped through the glass doors of Langston Maison, the most celebrated luxury boutique on Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills. Warren Tate wore a faded canvas jacket with a fraying cuff, scuffed leather shoes that had seen better seasons, and a plain watch with no visible logo resting against his wrist. He carried a worn paper bag folded at the top and moved through the entrance with the unhurried calm of someone who had nothing to prove and nowhere more important to be. Two sales associates near the handbag display exchanged a quick glance, each silently deciding the other should be the one to handle it. Fallon Briggs, standing closest to the door, stepped forward and offered him a warm smile. Meredith watched from across the polished floor, her lips pressed into a thin line. And she understood exactly what kind of customer this was. What no one in that gilded room knew, not the security guard, not the whispering associates, not Meredith herself, was that Warren Tate had not come to buy a blazer or a pair of shoes or even the limited edition jacket displayed behind glass at the far end of the showroom. He had come to decide whether to buy the entire store. Never judge a customer by a worn jacket, because sometimes the man inside it is deciding whether to own the building you're standing in. Langston Maison had occupied its corner address on Rodeo Drive for 22 years, and in that time it had constructed a reputation as carefully as any Swiss watchmaker assembles a movement, with patience, with precision, and with the deliberate exclusion of anything that did not conform to a particular image of wealth. The showroom floor was finished in pale travertine, and the overhead lighting had been engineered by a specialist from Milan, whose sole purpose had been to make even the most ordinary garment appear like an object of quiet devotion. Display cases ran the full length of the west wall, each one holding leather goods and jewelry priced beyond what most working Americans brought home in a year, and the racks near the center of the floor carried suits and evening gowns in limited editions that were never advertised anywhere a casual browser might encounter them. This was not a boutique that welcomed curiosity or aspiration. It had been designed, from its very first season in business, to serve a specific kind of customer. The kind who wore their wealth as naturally as they wore their skin, who arrived in vehicles that required reserved parking, and who called ahead before they visited because their time, they had long since been made to feel, was more valuable than the transaction itself. Meredith Langston had managed the boutique for 11 of those 22 years, and she had shaped the culture of the floor as deliberately as any designer, whose work hung on its racks. She understood the unspoken hierarchy of luxury retail with something approaching an art form, who to greet first when two customers arrived simultaneously, who to seat in the low velvet chairs near the fitting rooms, who to offer a glass of champagne before they had even removed their coat, and who to keep politely and firmly at a distance until they either spent money or left. She had never written these rules down anywhere visible, but every person who worked beneath her had absorbed them within the first 2 weeks on the floor, often without being told a single word directly. The clientele were the kind of people whose names appeared in certain columns in certain publications. Actors between major projects who had inherited more money than they could reasonably spend. Technology founders who wore understated clothes but carried cards with no spending limits. And the adult children of industrialists who refreshed their wardrobes each season the way ordinary people cleaned out a closet. They all moved a certain way. They all dressed within a certain register. and Warren Tate, standing near the entrance with his plain paper bag and his patient expression, did not move or dress like any of them. Meredith had made that assessment in the first 4 seconds, and the entire architecture of her afternoon had already adjusted around it. She did not approach him herself. That would have been a waste of her particular skills. Instead, she watched as Fallon Briggs, the newest member of the sales team, and the one Meredith privately considered most in need of refinement, moved toward the man with an open expression and a genuine smile. The kind that came from someone who had not yet learned to calibrate warmth, according to the apparent net worth of the person receiving it. The other associates drifted back toward their preferred stations, finding small tasks to occupy their hands, making it clear through 100 small gestures that they had already written this particular visitor out of their afternoon. Warren looked around the showroom slowly, taking in the cases and the racks and the high ceilings, with the composed attention of a man who was cataloging rather than browsing, though no one observing him from a distance would have been able to articulate exactly what made the difference. Fallon greeted him by the door. He thanked her, and his voice when he spoke was quieter and more measured than she had expected. Meredith watched from across the floor, already certain she was right about him, already looking forward to the moment when he would nod politely and leave. Warren asked to see the new collection, and Fallon led him toward the central display without hesitation, moving through the showroom with the easy confidence of someone who genuinely loved the clothes she was paid to sell. She introduced each piece with specific detail: the weight of the wool in a particular charcoal blazer, the Portuguese factory responsible for the construction of a pair of trousers, the Italian mill that had supplied the fabric for a slim-cut evening jacket the color of deep water. Warren listened carefully, and then he began to ask questions that made Fallon pause mid-sentence, not from confusion but from surprise. He wanted to know whether the stitching on the lapel of one jacket was single or double needle, and he asked about the tension before she had finished explaining the construction. He asked which season the house had introduced a particular shade of navy, and whether it had been revised in subsequent years, and when Fallon gave him the correct answer, he nodded in a way that told her he had already known it, and was testing the accuracy of what she said. He picked up a jacket from the rack, turned it inside out with practiced hands, and examined the interior seam with the unhurried focus of someone who was not performing knowledge, but simply exercising it. Fallon had worked in luxury retail for 5 years across 3 different boutiques before landing at Langston Maison, and in that time, she had served clients with generational wealth, celebrities with stylists on retainer, and once an actual member of a European royal family who had the decency to be completely unimpressed by her own title. None of them had asked about the history of a specific dye lot the way Warren did. None of them had held the collar of an evening coat up to the light, and identified the precise percentage of cashmere in the blend from the handle of the fabric alone. She found herself speaking more freely, describing the creative director's intentions for the season with genuine enthusiasm, feeling for the first time in months that she was actually talking about clothes with someone who cared about the same things she did. Across the floor, Meredith watched the exchange with a growing discomfort that she would have described, if pressed, as concern for the efficiency of the afternoon. She pulled one of the more senior associates aside, near the accessories wall. Her voice was barely above a murmur. "Watch him closely," she said again, this time with a nod toward the security guard, stationed near the east wall. The guard repositioned himself within a few steps of where Warren and Fallon stood examining the collection. A second associate, ostensibly tidying a nearby rack, moved closer as well. Warren noticed both of them within moments, the subtle shift in the room's attention, the way the guard found reasons to adjust his stance and stay nearby, the associate who was folding and refolding the same jacket sleeve without looking at it. He noticed all of it, and he said nothing. He asked Fallon about the provenance of a particular hand-stitched detail on a coat near the back of the rack, and she answered him, and he listened, and the afternoon light shifted slowly through the boutique's tall windows, while Meredith stood at a distance and watched, and was entirely certain she understood the situation. Warren looked at Fallon and asked, in a tone that was entirely conversational. "Is this how every customer is treated here? Or is there a particular reason for the attention?" Fallon felt the heat rise in her face and had no answer that did not implicate either her employer or herself. Meredith crossed the floor a few minutes later with the particular walk she had perfected over 2 decades of luxury retail. A walk that communicated authority and graciousness simultaneously, that said both "I am in charge here" and "I am being wonderfully generous with my time." She introduced herself to Warren with a handshake and a smile that reached exactly as far as it needed to and no further. She told him that Langston Maison had a wonderful selection this season and that he was very welcome to browse. Then she tilted her head in a gesture of what she intended to appear as helpful candor and mentioned that some of the pieces in the new collection were at a rather elevated price point and that they also had a wonderful relationship with a boutique 2 streets over that carried accessible luxury at a more approachable range. Warren listened to all of this without changing his expression. He thanked her for the information and then turned back to the rack and asked to see the limited edition overcoat displayed near the far end of the showroom, the one behind the glass panel, in the deep tobacco brown, the one with the hand-applied top stitching along the collar and cuffs. Meredith told him, with great warmth and the suggestion of genuine regret, that the piece was part of a specially curated presentation, reserved for clients who had booked a private appointment in advance, and that, unfortunately, the current availability for that program was rather limited. A woman in a cream blazer standing nearby. A regular client named Savannah Drake, whose family had shopped the boutique for 3 generations, caught the exchange from the corner of her eye and made a small sound that was not quite a laugh but lived in the same neighborhood. She murmured something to her companion about how some people saw a price tag and assumed it was a suggestion rather than a barrier. Fallon heard it. She began to say something, started to turn toward the 2 women, and Meredith spoke first, redirecting the conversation with the smooth competence of someone who had been managing floors and egos for a very long time. Warren did not respond to any of it. He stood still for a moment, his hands at his sides, his expression unchanged. Then he turned slowly and looked around the entire room. The full floor, the display cases, the racks, the lighting, the staff at their positions, the security guard still hovering within earshot. He looked at it all with the focused, assessing attention of someone taking inventory. Then he asked Fallon, quietly but clearly enough to be heard by anyone within a few feet, what the total value of the entire collection currently on the floor would be if purchased outright. Meredith Langston blinked. Then she produced a small, polished laugh that was meant to signal that the question was charming, but not quite serious. "Are you asking for your own amusement?" she said. "Or is this something you're genuinely considering?" Warren did not answer her directly. He reached into the pocket of his faded canvas jacket and retrieved a phone, and he stepped a few feet away from the rack and placed a call. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. Fallon, standing near enough to hear fragments, caught only a name and a number. Warren said, "I've seen enough. Move forward with the final step." He ended the call and returned the phone to his pocket. Meredith watched from across the floor and assumed she was witnessing a man trying to save face after a difficult afternoon, manufacturing the impression of a purpose he did not have. She had seen variations of this before, customers who felt embarrassed by their inability to afford something and reached for their phones as a social prop, as a way of suggesting that the store's prices were beneath their consideration rather than beyond their reach. She read Warren's phone call through this lens with complete confidence. What she did not know, because Preston Hale had been careful about the details he had shared with his staff, was that the owner of Langston Maison had been in quiet, difficult conversations with an acquisitions attorney for the better part of 4 months. Preston Hale was 53 years old and had inherited the boutique from his mother, who had built it from a single small shop into a name that meant something on a particular level of the market. He had managed it with a combination of genuine taste and financial carelessness that had produced, over the last several years, a gap between the boutique's reputation and its actual ledger that had become impossible to close through ordinary means. The debts were not scandalous. They were the quiet, accumulating kind. real estate pressures, a failed expansion to a second location, a legal settlement that had drained reserves he had counted on. Preston still arrived each morning in clothes that cost more than most people spent on a month of groceries. He still greeted clients by name and poured the same champagne, and maintained every outward element of the operation as though nothing had changed. But the acquisition agreement sitting in a folder in his office, with its wire transfer details, and its transfer of title language, and its conditions for closing, represented the end of something he had spent 20 years pretending was permanent. He had not told Meredith. He had not told any of his managers. He had told himself this was to avoid disruption. But the real reason was simpler and less flattering. He was not ready to watch the people who worked for him look at him the way they would when they knew. Sterling Quinn, the acquisitions attorney representing the buyer, had been given access to the building's operational records and had spent 2 weeks reviewing everything before the final meeting was scheduled. The buyer had requested one condition before signing: a personal visit to the boutique, unannounced, to observe the operation directly. Preston had agreed without fully considering what an unannounced visit might reveal. Upstairs in the office suite, Preston's assistant appeared at the door. The attorney's car was in front. Preston straightened his tie and moved toward the stairs. Below him, on the showroom floor, Meredith was still watching Warren Tate, with the calm certainty of a woman who believed she had the afternoon entirely understood. A black sedan sat at the curb outside the boutique's glass facade, and a man in a gray suit stepped out with a leather portfolio under his arm and walked toward the entrance with the deliberate pace of someone who had an appointment. Sterling Quinn entered Langston Maison the way lawyers of his particular practice always entered rooms, without announcement, without hurry, with the settled authority of someone who understood that the room's existing order was about to be reorganized around his presence. He was 67 years old, with silver hair and the kind of lean, considered posture that suggested a long history of being the most composed person in difficult conversations. Meredith saw him from across the floor and recalibrated immediately. This was the kind of client she recognized, the kind she had spent years learning to approach with exactly the right combination of deference and elegance. She moved toward him with her best smile and her best walk, and was halfway across the travertine when Sterling Quinn changed direction. He had spotted Warren Tate near the central rack, and he walked toward him with the directness of a man who knew where he was going, and he said clearly enough to carry across the immediate area of the floor, "Mr. Tate, my apologies for the delay. The showroom went quiet in the particular way that expensive rooms go quiet when something unexpected has entered the atmosphere." Meredith stopped walking. Fallon, standing next to Warren, watched Sterling extend a hand and watched Warren take it with the same measured composure he had carried through the entire afternoon. Sterling set the leather portfolio on the glass-top display counter beside them and opened it to a set of documents that ran to several dozen pages, each section tabbed with colored markers. Preston Hale appeared from the direction of the back staircase, moving quickly, his expression tight in the way of a man arriving at a scene he had hoped to manage more carefully. Fallon's eyes dropped to the cover page of the document nearest her, and she read the heading before she could stop herself. Full Acquisition Agreement, Langston Maison Holdings, LLC. The date was that week. The buyer's name was listed in full on the second line, and it was Warren Tate. She looked up at him. He was reading through the first section of the document, with the focused attention he had given every question about fabric and construction during the afternoon. And he had the same expression: unhurried, precise, entirely self-contained. Sterling said, "The transfer is structured as agreed, effective upon your signature on pages 12, 29, and 44, with the wire confirmation to follow within 24 hours. Warren nodded. He accepted the pen Sterling offered him. Preston Hale arrived at the counter and opened his mouth, and then closed it again, because Sterling turned toward him with a look that said, without any words, that this was not the moment for commentary from the current owner. Warren signed. He returned the pen to Sterling without flourish. Sterling countersigned 2 of the pages himself, notarized a third, and said, With the quiet finality of someone closing a transaction that had been weeks in preparation, Langston Maison is now the property of Warren Tate. The security guard who had spent the afternoon positioned within a few steps of Warren stood very still near the east wall. Savannah Drake, still in her cream blazer near the accessories display, had gone entirely silent. Meredith Langston had not moved from where she had stopped in the middle of the floor. Warren looked at her from across the cases and the racks and the pale travertine and the engineered light. He spoke in the same quiet, measured tone he had used all afternoon. "Now that this is settled," he said, "do I still need to be watched closely?" Meredith recovered quickly, because she was very good at recovering, and what she offered next was a version of an explanation that had the structure of an apology, without quite containing the substance of one. She said that the security procedures were a standard part of the boutique's operational protocol, applied consistently to all guests, and that she hoped the afternoon had not given any impression other than the professionalism that Langston Maison had maintained for more than 2 decades. Preston Hale placed a hand briefly on the display counter and then removed it, and suggested, with the strained warmth of a man who had sold something he loved for reasons he could not say out loud, that perhaps the group might adjourn to the private consultation room upstairs, where they could speak more comfortably. Warren told him no. He said that what had occurred that afternoon had occurred on this floor, in front of the staff who worked here and the clients who shopped here, and that the appropriate place to address it was where it had happened. He asked Fallon to stand where she was, and he asked Sterling to remain at the counter, and he told Preston and Meredith to listen. Then he explained, without raising his voice, what the afternoon had represented from his perspective. He had entered the boutique as any customer might enter it. He had asked to see the collection. He had been followed by security at the instruction of the floor manager. He had been guided, with the careful language of condescension, toward the exit or toward a cheaper alternative. He had been told that a garment on display was unavailable to him by the same logic that made it available to other people standing 20 feet away. And when he had asked a direct question about the value of the inventory, he had been mocked. He paused and looked at Fallon. He asked her to describe, in her own words, what she had observed during the afternoon. Fallon understood what she was being asked and why, and she took a breath and did it honestly. She described the glances between associates when Warren first came through the door. She described the way the floor had organized itself around his presence, not to welcome him but to contain him. She described Meredith's instruction to security, which she had overheard. She described the moment she had started to speak on Warren's behalf and been cut off. She said that in the 5 months she had worked at the boutique, she had observed this pattern applied to certain customers repeatedly. Customers who did not dress expensively. Customers who were visibly not from the background the store had decided it was built for, and that she had raised the issue once, quietly, with a senior colleague, and been told that this was simply how luxury retail operated. Celeste Mercer emerged from the hallway that led to the creative offices at the back of the building, while Fallon was still speaking. She was the boutique's creative director, and she had been in a meeting with 2 of her designers when Sterling's car had appeared at the curb, and she had come down not knowing what she was walking into. She heard the last portion of what Fallon said, and she looked at Warren, and then she looked at Meredith, and then she spoke without being asked. She said that she had raised the same concern on 3 separate occasions over the last 2 years. She said that she had documented her objections in written form after the second conversation and had received no substantive response. She said that the store's culture of customer evaluation was, in her professional and personal view, incompatible with what luxury actually meant, and that she had stayed because she believed the creative work mattered, and because she had hoped the problem would eventually be addressed by someone with the authority to address it. She looked at Warren when she said that last part. Warren listened to all of it, and then he requested that all transactions on the floor be suspended for the remainder of the day, and that every member of the staff be gathered in the showroom before 6 o'clock. Sterling laid a second document on the counter while the staff were being assembled. It was a summary of customer feedback records, formal complaints, written reviews submitted through the boutique's own channels, and documentation gathered from external sources over the preceding 3 years. The majority of the grievances followed a pattern that required no particular expertise to identify. Customers had been made to feel unwelcome based on what they were wearing when they arrived. Customers had been followed through the store without cause. Customers had been redirected toward lower-priced items or toward other stores before they had communicated any preference or budget. Customers had been addressed in ways that communicated, with varying degrees of subtlety, that the boutique did not consider them the appropriate kind of client. The complaints came from people of different backgrounds, but the pattern had a center of gravity that was not difficult to read. Meredith had seen most of these complaints during her time as manager. She had addressed some of them with the standard language of customer service correspondence: regret for the experience, assurance of high standards, a discount code attached like a bandage over a structural wound. Others she had logged and not escalated because the boutique's revenue had remained strong, and Preston had never asked her directly about the feedback volume, and she had made the calculation, consciously or not, that strong sales absolved the operation of the need to examine its own behavior. Preston, for his part, had known enough of what was happening to feel mildly uncomfortable at occasional moments, and not enough discomfort to act on it. Celeste had known in full. She had compiled her own file, separate from the official records, and she produced it that afternoon from a drawer in her office and added it to the documents Sterling had spread across the counter. Her file contained the names of designers who had been treated dismissively by Meredith during vendor meetings, because their aesthetic sensibilities did not align with the boutique's existing identity. It contained notes from conversations with clients who had stopped coming in and, when asked why, had explained with more honesty than the boutique deserved. It contained a sketch that Celeste had made during a particularly frustrating afternoon. A drawing of the boutique's entrance from the outside, with a note written in her own hand that read, "Who are we actually telling to come in, and who are we telling to go away?" Warren stood near the counter and looked at the documents for a long moment. He said that his father had been a laborer in Georgia, the kind of man who wore his work in the calluses on his hands and the creases of his clothes. He said that his father had once walked into a department store in a city where he was traveling for work, wearing his work clothes because they were what he owned, and had been told within 3 minutes of entering that the store was closing early that day. A claim that was plainly false, given that other customers continued to shop undisturbed. His father had left without saying anything and had never gone back to that city if he could avoid it. Warren said he had not purchased Langston Maison because of that memory. He had purchased it because he believed there was a version of this business that did not require deciding who deserved to be made to feel beautiful before they had spent a single dollar. He said, "I didn't buy this place to settle a score. I bought it to change the reason people walk through that door." The staff gathered in the showroom at 6 o'clock as requested. They stood among the racks and the display cases and the pale travertine in the engineered light, 21 people in total, and Warren stood at the center of the floor without a lectern or a microphone or any of the staging that usually accompanied an announcement of this kind. He spoke for about 20 minutes, and the content of what he said was not what most of them had expected. He did not shout. He did not describe what had happened that afternoon as an outrage requiring a demonstration of anger. He spoke about the difference between luxury and arrogance, because he thought the two words had become confused in this building over a long period of time, and he believed the confusion was worth unpacking carefully before it could be corrected. He said that luxury in its truest form was about the quality of the thing, the precision of the cut, the integrity of the material, the skill of the person whose hands had done the work. He said that arrogance was the belief that the quality of the thing conferred the right to decide which people deserved to experience it. He asked the room, directly, were they in the business of selling beautiful things, or were they in the business of making certain people feel lesser than the beautiful things? Several people in the room found things to examine on the floor near their feet. He asked each person present to think about a moment when they had made a judgment about a customer. Before that customer had said a word, when they had looked at what someone was wearing, or how they moved, or where they seemed to come from, and had decided, before the interaction began, how much of their attention and their warmth that person deserved. He said he was not asking them to confess this in front of each other. He was asking them to sit with it privately, because he intended to rebuild the culture of this floor on the opposite foundation. And the work could not be done by people who had not been honest with themselves first. Meredith asked to speak. She stood near the accessories wall and said that she had always maintained the standards of the boutique to the best of her ability, and that the store's reputation was something she had given years of her life to building, and that she hoped her record of service would be considered alongside the events of the afternoon. Warren listened without expression. He acknowledged that she had contributed to the boutique's commercial success over a long period of time. He said that the record also showed a pattern of decisions that had caused harm to customers who did not deserve it, and that these things were both true, and that holding both of them at the same time was part of what honesty required. He announced that Meredith would be suspended from her management role effective immediately, pending a structured review process, and that during that time she would have the opportunity to participate in a retraining program if she chose to do so. The following morning, Warren asked Fallon to meet him in the consultation room at 9 o'clock. She arrived to find him already seated at the small table near the window, with a cup of coffee and no papers in front of him. He asked her why she had greeted him the way she had the previous afternoon, when the rest of the staff had made their decision by degrees, piece by piece from across the floor. She was quiet for a moment, and then she told him about her mother. Her mother had worked maintenance in a large shopping mall in Ohio for 11 years. Early mornings, weekends, the holidays that other people spent with their families. She had cleaned floors and emptied bins and fixed the small mechanical failures of a retail environment that existed, in its entirety, to sell things to people who were not her. She had done this work without complaint and with consistent dignity, and the people who passed her in the corridors of that mall had looked through her, in the way that people look through the infrastructure of a space, acknowledging it abstractly as something that must exist, while declining to register it as a presence with any particular weight. Fallon had gone to see her mother at work once, when she was 11 years old, and she had watched a man in an expensive coat step past her mother, with a contempt so automatic it appeared unconscious. She had watched her mother's face and had decided something that afternoon, without the vocabulary to name it yet, about the kind of person she did not want to become. Warren listened without speaking until she was finished. He told her that this was the kind of clarity that could not be taught in a training program, that it was more valuable than a decade of sales technique, and that it was exactly what he needed in the role he had in mind. He explained that the boutique's primary failure was not in its merchandise, or its marketing, or its physical environment, all of which were genuinely excellent, but in the experience it created for the people who walked through the door. He asked Fallon to step into a newly created position as Interim Client Experience Director, with Celeste as her counterpart on the creative side. Fallon's first response was to tell him she was not qualified. His second response was to tell her that was not the question he had asked. She accepted the role. Celeste, who had been asked to join the final portion of the meeting, nodded at Fallon with the kind of smile that said, "I have been waiting for this conversation for 2 years." The policies Warren announced in the days that followed the acquisition were not complicated, but they required the staff to unlearn habits that had been reinforced over years of working in an environment where those habits had been rewarded. The first policy was the simplest. No guest would be followed through the store without a specific, documented, security-relevant reason. The second was an extension of the first. Every person who entered the boutique would receive the same quality of greeting and the same access to the collection, regardless of how they were dressed or how they had arrived. The third concerned the complaints process, which was restructured so that customer feedback went to an independent review channel rather than through the floor manager, ensuring that negative experiences could not be quietly buried at any stage. The fourth was a staff development commitment. All existing employees would complete a 2-day service retraining program built around the principles Celeste had spent 2 years trying to establish from within, and new hires would go through the same program before their first day on the floor. The fifth policy was the one that drew the most attention when it was eventually reported. Warren committed a portion of the boutique's annual operating profit to a design scholarship fund, structured to support young people from low-income backgrounds who wanted to pursue careers in fashion and could not otherwise access the training. The first round of scholarship announcements was scheduled for the following spring. Celeste, who had been developing a new collection in the weeks before the acquisition, redirected its central theme in response to the events of the acquisition week. The collection she ultimately presented was built around the concept of dignity, not as an aesthetic idea but as a structural principle, expressed in clothes that were made to last, made to fit bodies across a wide range, and made to be worn, rather than displayed. Preston Hale signed the final transfer paperwork and quietly left the building on a Thursday afternoon, carrying 2 personal items and a memory of his mother's opening day that he had not expected to feel quite so strongly on the way out. Meredith was sent the details of the retraining program by certified mail. She did not respond for 2 weeks. When she did respond, she requested to be assigned to the earliest available session. The note she included with her response was 3 sentences long, and it said, among other things, that she had been thinking about a specific afternoon from several years prior when a customer had left the boutique in visible distress, and she had gone home that evening and had not thought about it again. She said she was thinking about it now. The boutique closed for a full week to allow the operational changes to be implemented and the staff retraining to begin. When it reopened on a Monday morning in early autumn, the travertine was the same, and the display cases were the same, and the lighting was exactly as it had always been, and none of these things had changed because none of them had been the problem. What had changed was the temperature of the room the moment a person walked through the door. An elderly man arrived mid-morning in a work coat and sensible shoes, carrying a canvas tote from a grocery store. He had recently retired from a career repairing fine watches and had spent 40 years admiring certain objects from a professional distance, close enough to understand their construction, but never in a position to own them. Fallon greeted him at the door by name. She had looked up his appointment, which he had made through the new public booking system, the one that did not require a referral, and she walked with him to the cases along the west wall and spent 45 minutes showing him timepieces he had spent a career working on from the other side of the glass. The associates on the floor were different in ways that were easier to observe than to describe. They did not size up each arrival. They did not look at shoes before they looked at faces. They did not calculate, in the first moment of contact, whether a person was worth their warmth. Several of them found this adjustment genuinely difficult in the beginning, not because they were unkind people, but because the habit had been so thoroughly wired into the daily experience of the floor that resisting it required a kind of continuous, conscious effort that was exhausting until it became natural. By the end of the first week, it was beginning to become natural. The boutique's revenue in the first month of the new operation did not decline. It grew, modestly at first, and then more steadily, because the story of what had happened on that particular afternoon had moved through the circles where such stories travel. And some of the people who came in as a result were curious, and some of them were testing, and most of them stayed longer than they had planned, because the experience of being in the store was no longer calibrated to make certain people feel that they were imposing. Warren came in during the 3rd week of the reopened operation, wearing the same faded canvas jacket and the same scuffed leather shoes and the same plain watch, and walked through the door in the early afternoon. No one followed him. 3 different staff members greeted him as he moved through the floor, each of them using his name. Fallon found him near the end of the afternoon, standing in front of the display case along the west wall, where the limited edition overcoat was now on open display. The tobacco brown one with the hand-applied eye-top stitching. The one Meredith had told him was unavailable to him 8 weeks earlier. Fallon stood beside him and told him that the scholarship program had received its first complete application and that the panel reviewing it had made their recommendation and that the recipient was the 20-year-old daughter of one of the building's overnight cleaning staff, a young woman who had been drawing clothes since she was in middle school and had applied to design programs twice before without the financial means to attend. The scholarship covered tuition, materials, and a stipend for 2 years. The young woman had been told the previous afternoon. She had cried for a long time, and then she had called her mother at work, and her mother had cried too, and the two of them had stayed on the phone for an hour, talking about nothing except what might come next. Warren was quiet for a moment after Fallon finished. He looked at the coat in the case, not with longing or possession, just with the same appraising calm he brought to everything. And then he looked at Fallon and said that a boutique like this one had always had the power to make people feel that beauty was something for them, something accessible by right of their humanity rather than the contents of their account. He said, "A luxury store shouldn't make people who have less feel smaller than what it sells. It should make them believe that beauty has a place for them too, even if they're standing on the outside of the glass." Fallon was quiet for a moment and then said she was going to have that painted on the wall of the staff room. Warren did not smile often, but he smiled then. Outside the tall windows, the afternoon light was doing what it always did in Beverly Hills at that hour, lying across the surfaces of things with a warmth that made everything look, briefly, as though it had been made for exactly this moment. Inside the boutique, a young woman in ordinary clothes stood near the entrance and looked at the collection with open eyes, and a staff member walked toward her without a calculation in the world and said, "Welcome." They had watched Warren Tate closely the first time he walked through that door, convinced that a man in a faded jacket and scuffed shoes had wandered into the wrong building. They had read every signal they believed they understood, and had arrived at a conclusion that said more about their assumptions than about the man standing in front of them. And what Warren had done in the end was not simply sign his name to a document and take control of an asset. He had bought back the possibility that a room full of beautiful things could also be, without apology or condition, a room that understood the first obligation of anyone in the business of making people feel something, to see the person in front of you before you see anything else.